Thank you, Paige, for that wonderful introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. It's really a pleasure to be here with you to talk about some beautiful pictures, especially in relationship to the fabulous exhibition that my colleague Katie Hansen has installed about Van Gogh and the Roulin family. Really excited to be here. First, I should, as that introduction suggested, I'm a specialist of 17th century Dutch and Flemish art, so I'm coming at this very much what we're going to be talking about. I'm coming at it from the historical side, looking at how Van Gogh is looking back. So I want to flag that here. And I think as we begin, the influence can be quite stunningly clear. Here we have on the left a wonderful portrait by Frans Hals and Van Gogh on the right, where we have clear formal relationships despite the changes in color. An older caregiver with a young child on the lap. And this is really a distinctive composition. Some of the things we'll be looking at throughout the day are more formulaic or conventional. Hals's presentation is really rather unique, so it's pretty easy to see how Van Gogh was looking directly at this particular example. Now, also as a foreground of what we'll be looking at much more deeply, it is not a copy. It is a reworking. He's inspired. He takes ideas, pictorial solutions from the works of historical predecessors, but then infuses them with his own distinctive approach. And that's very much what we're going to be looking at. And we're going to be looking at this. What are we going to be covering today? So we're going to be covering a variety of things, looking especially at Hals, but not exclusively, also Rembrandt, Karel Fabritius, and how Van Gogh really engaged with these historical Dutch artists. Why he sought them out, and as preview, he's working very much in a time of a historical revival of interest in the 19th century, in 17th century Dutch art, and these artists in particular. And also how these considerations can help us better understand Van Gogh's project, especially his portraits of the Roulin family. It's also, at its most base level, this is a story about painting. We will be looking at prints, but it's really about how Van Gogh is thinking about a story of influence, a story of painting, and how these are communicated in referential forms, even in brushstrokes. But let's start with Rembrandt. Here we have in the exhibition this amazing painting by Van Gogh, The Raising of Lazarus, from about 1890. I'll also say that I won't be going strictly chronologically. I'll bounce back and forth so that I can keep my thematic groupings here. What we have, amongst other things, a fairly traditional subject. The daughters, the two women, are from Arles, and the background is Saint-Remy. But really where he's coming from is he's reworking Rembrandt's Raising of Lazarus print. And what we have is, a powerful, moving image, surprise and action, a jarring palette on the case of Van Gogh that really makes us feel the energy, not just the outward gesture of the arms, but really the sense of stunning and even a reverberating, bristling of energy in all of those little swirls radiating out from the sun, radiating out from forms everywhere. There's almost a pent-up energy. And here we can begin to see also how he's getting further removed, even though this is probably the strictest example of something where Van Gogh is looking at Rembrandt, but he's not taking the whole thing, right? He's taking just this part. So he's gaining inspiration, but he's homing in on one very specific and particular aspect. And so we can also begin to see how Van Gogh is seeing. What is he seeing in these things that he is responding to? And Rembrandt was very much at the forefront of his mind. We have the great source, I find, working, so as a 17th century person, we have not a lot of material sometimes when we look for textual evidence. Van Gogh is a completely different case because he wrote many, many letters. And he mentioned Rembrandt 100 separate times in the letters over the course of his career. For example, Van Gogh wrote to his brother Theo in 1888, encouraging Theo, quote, always to look at the portrait of old Six. the fine portrait with the glove for your future. We'll look at that one in a minute. And the Rembrandt etching. 6, reading by a window in a ray of sunlight for your past and your present. Makes perfect sense to me that Van Gogh would turn to an image like this, a stunning and rather dramatic portrayal of the interior life. We have, this is Rembrandt's portrait of Jan 6, leaning and reading by a window. We see, we don't know exactly what he's reading, but he's very casual. His collar is undone. His sword and his cloak are beside him. He has come in, but he's just relaxing in front of the window. And something that we'll come back to, notice how he's really emphasized the face and the forehead, the area of thought. And what we get is 6 looking down, reading. We don't know what he's thinking, but it is a picture about someone looking inwards. And of course, this makes perfect sense for Van Gogh, who was so much thinking about the interior presence. The painting of Jan 6 that he mentioned is this one. And here, too, we can really imagine why Van Gogh would have looked at this one. This is a truly remarkable painting. It is unconventional. We have this deep, intense gaze on the part of Jan 6, that subtle turn of the head. Here he has his cloak on one shoulder, but it is that act of putting on the glove. He's not posing in the traditional way of just sitting three-quartered. He's just casually taking something really extremely common as he is about to either enter or leave whatever premises he is inhabiting. And so we have this interest in a person, in the interior of a person, the thinking, but also as we begin to look at it, the bold brushworks. Not the same brushwork that Van Gogh is using, but look at how, even though at considerable distance, those gold read as brushstrokes. Rembrandt is not trying to cover that up in any way, shape, or form. He gives you the sense of there is perhaps a clasp that helps connect the cloak or the coat when it is done, or these where this is the sleeve, but we really don't get a form underneath it. If you look closely at that, it is a flat area of red and black. Very abstract if you really think about it. And how amazing this must have been in Rembrandt's time to see something like this, a very unique approach, a painterly approach, we would call it, wherein the artist is utilizing and maximizing the things that one can only do in paint. And we know Van Gogh was really, really interested. His letters are filled with passages of where he's talking and thinking about what is painting. What does it mean to make art? Yes, but also, or more specifically, painting. What does it mean? How do you communicate through color, through strokes, through forms, through light? These passages are filled throughout Van Gogh's letters, which really makes them a treasure trove for art historians. Now, he didn't comment upon our painting, but one would imagine that he really would have loved something like this, because that's what Rembrandt himself is doing, is thinking about what he's painting. Right? One of my absolute favorite things, not only in this museum but in any, this very early work by Rembrandt, before he has moved to Amsterdam, before he has become the star in the art market, before he is lauded near and far, and we have a very simple depiction. The color scheme is pretty muted. We have a painter holding brush, holding his palette, holding the maul stick, which is what you use so your elbow doesn't scrape the paint away. We see a relatively large panel sitting on an easel, and that's basically it. But unlike a conventional self-portrait, and in fact we don't know whether this was really meaning to be Rembrandt himself or whether someone who looks kind of like Rembrandt standing in for a generic artist, but he's not in the act of painting. He's standing back. And that distance, that gap, is what really makes this special. That and that we have no idea what is actually on the easel. He shows us the back. So we know he is painting. So what is he doing? He's thinking. He's thinking either about what he is about to paint, what he has already painted, what he should paint. We're not really sure, but it is that distance, that hand that is at his side rather than touching brush to surface, where we get this idea of thinking about what is painting, the interiority of the artist in this case. Not Jan Six, the portrait of somebody else who's reading and thinking, and we get a sense of a thinking individual. In this case, the individual is an artist. Here, not as much with the spotlight, but instead with that moody hat which covers up and creates shadows. I always think of this as like the book jacket photo from your author who's presenting themselves as very creative and thoughtful. But I think about this, right? So he's articulating, Rembrandt is articulating, we don't have a treatise from Rembrandt. He's talking about, metaphorically, what he's painting through a painting. In his July 30th, 1888 letter, Van Gogh wrote, "Now what is Rembrandt? A painter of portraits." He doesn't mention this particular portrait, but this portrait that is part of the gift from the Van Artelus to the museum, really the crown jewel in that, stands in for lots of different conventional types of approaches. Here we have not someone who's in an unconventional pose, but this really sitting in an oval, no movements of the hands or arms, but really it is about the physical appearance. So very different, also different in style. This is earlier in Rembrandt's career, when he's not long after the artist in the studio, but 20 years before the Jan Six painting. So it's much more meticulous, but it's equally probing, I would argue. And maybe we see that even more when we think about it in relationship to Van Gogh here in the museum. You can see how Van Gogh is thinking about the example of conventional types of portraits, of a woman sitting three-quartered, facing to your left. We also get a sense of really, even though it's done in completely different styles, of trying to, again, picture a person, by which I mean not just a physical appearance, but a person who thinks, who lives, who feels. And that's part of the beauty of the Rembrandt. While it is hyper-naturalistic and it is an exquisite condition, we get a sense of who this person is. The label tells us her name, but even without that, you get a sense, right? The highlight on that brow, on the forehead, is really what, for me, is amazing. The light shadowing on her left side of, or right side, you're looking at your right, her left, side of her face, that really makes her seem as if she is a living, breathing, three-dimensional person. Because what is a portrait, after all? It's about the essence, distilling the essence, about portraying someone, capturing an image of someone as distinct. You don't want to have a portrait that looks like somebody else. The whole point is to be you, to be unique. And that's what Rembrandt is doing, capturing the individual and communicating that. Van Gogh has different tools at his disposal in terms of using the greens, but look at the face and the emphasis on the forehead. There it's not light, but you really get a sense through the pulled back hair. He too is trying to picture Madame Roulin as a thinking, feeling individual, even if her face is properly stoic. And it is the artist's role, which is part of what Van Gogh is so interested in thinking about his role and how he brings that truth, that essence, that distinctness, that uniqueness of the sitter into being in the painting. Van Gogh saw these two paintings, and they hung relatively close together, but he links them in a couple of occasions. He says, "Above all, I admired hands by Rembrandt and Hals. Hands that lived, that were not finished in the sense that people want to enforce nowadays, particular hands in the Syndics, even, and in the Jewish Bride." Rembrandt is a master of many things, and part of it is this choreography. These are still the images, but if we look at all the variety of the hands, the one individual who's pushing up from the table in the chair, another who is holding the bag of money, these two who are sharing this ledger of which they are approaching. And getting all of these adds very much to the complexity of what we see in the faces, or even more in a single image, that touching gesture in the Jewish Bride, so-called Jewish Bride, where the man is touching so gracefully and gently, and how the woman rests her hand on top of his in a reciprocal gesture. And how that complements how he's using these very specific skills of communicating through the hands to tell a story. That other sense of what he's getting at, we'll get at a little bit more about this idea of finish. That's something that we'll perhaps see a little bit better. Maybe less complete, but you start looking at the hands in Van Gogh, and he's doing some interesting things too. Because he writes about these things, and he's writing about specific pictures or artists that he sees, and he picks up on them, and then if you compare those to what he does in his own art, you can see he's learning. He's learning, he's processing, he's adapting. But this gesture of which we looked at earlier from the Philadelphia picture of Madame Roulin here holding the young child, and that outward, tenuous, innocent, unstable position of baby Marcel is also communicating a lot of things to us. Or that simple gesture of the hands, the demure cupping of the hands together. And think about that then too, of what that communicates, a sense of calm, a sense of propriety, in contrast to this very complex uncomfortableness of the fingers that are resting together, which are maybe, to me anyway, suggesting a squirming young baby, or at least that's maybe my own experience with holding young children. But he continued. He wrote again about these pictures, and let me quote them at length, and I'll do this frequently throughout our time together. In 1885, Van Gogh wrote, "The Syndics is perfect, the finest Rembrandt, but that Jewish bride, not reckoned so much. What an intimate, what an infinitely sympathetic painting, painted with a glowing hand. You see, in the Syndics, Rembrandt is true to life, although even there he goes into the higher, into the very highest infinite. But yet Rembrandt could do something else. When he didn't have to be true in the literal sense, as he did in a portrait, when he could make poetry, be a poet, that's to say, creator, that's what he is in the Jewish bride. Oh, how Delacroix would have understood that very painting. What a noble sentiment, fathomlessly deep. One must have died many times to paint like this. It is certainly applicable here. Still, one can speak about the paintings by Frans Hals. He always remains on earth. Rembrandt goes so deep into the mysterious that he says things for which there are no words in any language. It is with justice that they call Rembrandt magician. That's no easy occupation." And you get a sense of that, right? You can feel what Van Gogh is saying about Rembrandt. And what is he focusing on? He's thinking about what Rembrandt can do, how he can meld really almost like magic or alchemy, taking base materials and create poetry. And he uses those words very intentionally, poet, creator, not just a painter, but he is accomplishing things that other people just can't do. And it is Rembrandt at the center of that narrative, the artist, marveling at, thinking about each work as a made object, made by a specific individual. It is the artist who accomplishes the wonders, and that's what Van Gogh aspires to be, a magician, a poet, not a transcriber of reality. And it is through his encounters with historical Dutch art such as this that he grapples with what he wants to accomplish in paint and what he wants to be as an artist. Rembrandt was a high bar indeed. Van Gogh certainly was ambitious. Changing course a little bit, an artist you may not be as familiar with, completely understandable. The least well-known of our three artists we're going to focus on, Carl Fabritius. And Van Gogh saw this in Rotterdam. It was in Rotterdam then as it is today. And he wrote in 1888 of it that it, quote, fits into a special category in which the portrait of a human being is transformed into something luminous and consoling. And that's very much what he reads from this. And we could get a sense of this here too. Maybe it's almost like the artist in the studio writ large. We get more details of the particular face, but that coloring. And think about the depths of the shadows, which are creating this very moody feel Here too, like Jan 6, but even more noticeable, we have the top of the shirt is open, some tufts of chest hair that are coming up, the loose locks that are flowing down. But really what we're looking at is those eyes that are peering out at us, a simple, relaxed expression otherwise, but there is an intensity to that individual. And it is Fabritius himself, which is something that, because Van Gogh is almost always thinking about these things and applying them to his own experiences. Interestingly, perhaps, that Carl Fabritius studied with Rembrandt in Amsterdam, and so he's thinking about following how one artist might be following the example of Rembrandt. Different colors, of course, but I think you get that same sort of intensity, or thinking about how you, right, you're standing in front of a mirror, you can choose to craft your face and your facial expression in any way that you want, but this is what Van Gogh chooses to do at this point in time. There's a seriousness to it, a deep penetrating. We don't have the hair, but that, not only the format, the conventional approach of a portrait in that composition, but really peering out. And of course, I'm always drawn to those passages of light on the forehead. So he's in a self-portrait. It does even more of what I was trying to articulate, where he's talking about the magic of Rembrandt, aligning an artist with his art. Right? That the work of art you don't view independently, you know who it is made by. And even more so from the artist's perspective, the ultimate self-portrait with a face, where you as the artist are the subject of art, is really making that boldly quite clear. That said, I find it really interesting that, as far as I can tell, Van Gogh did not respond to Rembrandt's self-portraits, even though he was probably the most prolific self-portraitist, certainly before, maybe in the entire history of art. Fabritius raises some interesting things for us. If you knew him before, you might know him from the Goldfinch, his most famous work. And this was actually the only other work by Fabritius that was known in Van Gogh's lifetime. Didn't have the advantage of Donna Tartt's novel, which thrust it into the popular imagination, but it really is, of course, a beautiful thing. So there, too, I find it really interesting, right? Van Gogh is looking at Rembrandt, who is Rembrandt, capital R, the great genius everybody admires. But Fabritius is an artist that there are only two pictures then known by. That's really quite distinctive, really thinking about and looking at artists. Fabritius, just for your own, is extremely interesting for his study period with Rembrandt, but then moving to Delft, where he in many ways anticipates Vermeer. But here he's doing something very different than he did in the self-portrait. Much brighter, lack of precision, and that pop of yellow. Maybe Van Gogh was taking some of this, even if he didn't write about this one in particular. Why are there only so few? Well, now we have a little bit more, including this picture in our own collection. One of now, we know of 12 paintings by Fabritius. He died extremely young when he was about 30 in a gunpowder explosion. But if you thought Vermeer had a small oeuvre at about 35, think about that. We only know 12 things. Really a genius who was stripped from the earth far too young. But I'd be remiss, this is a bit of sidebar, but still, if there are things in the collection, I have to share them. Very much, this is Fabritius, not in a very different way of thinking, much more like the self-portrait, more in that Rembrandt mode, and in a deeply human story. It comes from Ovid in the Metamorphosis that recounts some Roman myth of the mortal Aglaros. According to the story, the god Mercury falls in love with Aglaros' sister and offers Aglaros gold to bring him to her. Poisoned with jealousy by the goddess Minerva, Aglaros refuses. So we get this tale of deep emotion, something different than what we've seen in Van Gogh, but you can see why he turns to this type of art, the human story, the emotion, the feeling, and of course these thick, droopy applications of paint. I really do love this. This is smears and goops and not those bold brushstrokes of the Jan 6, but really you get a sense of a liquid medium, or maybe like metal before it is being forged. So you can get a sense of the humanity, you get a sense of the drama, you can get a sense of the things that Van Gogh appreciated and why Dutch art appealed to him as it does to many of us today. Now that said, the case of Fabricius raises a couple of other things, because he was not well known, did not know the entirety of his oeuvre, and what I want to shift gears now is to take it a little bit of a pathway into looking at the changes of taste. So 17th century Dutch art is many things. We're talking about a wide variety of production by a wide range of artists. It was many things to many people. Rembrandt, Fabricius, things a little bit later in the century, Gerrit Dou, Gerard Terborch, doing different types of things, quieter, more meticulous, not those boldly unbranded brushstrokes, but we get a sense of a material in the sense of the Terborch, that sheen of that satin, which is really amazing. This speaks to difference in taste. As you all know, taste is not universal, but it changes. These things were what were being more produced in the second half of the 17th century, or more in the third quarter is more accurate to say it. They're smaller in scale, finely painted. And in the 18th century, these were the types of things. When Dutch art was appreciated, when it was collected, when people turned to it, they appreciated things more like this. Think about how they correspond, for example, to things like Watteau, where you have these tales of, well, I should go back a little bit, right? We have a tale of amorous intrigue on the left. We have beautiful women who are undertaking things. We have a dashing gentleman who's flirting, and then on the other side, we can get with the Dou Dog. I think that really precision of paint and really a softness, a quietness, not drama. The types of things like in the Rococo that are really dominant. Painterly different colors of aesthetics, but you can get a sense of that there's an aesthetic in the culture that is, especially in France, but elsewhere in Europe as well, that's turning towards themes of love, themes of beauty, things of calm, of reserve. And that's what's percolating, permeating much of the early 18th century. In contrast to something like Rembrandt's Oath of Claudius Civilis, done towards the end of his life. He may have been a magician, but he was very much practicing a different aesthetic. Gold, moody, I use that word a lot. The boldness here in the story, this ancient tale, which he was probably given rather than came up with himself, the Oath of the Batavians, where the one-eyed chieftain is at a banquet and convinces his compatriots to join him in rebellion. Dark, brooding. And even in Rembrandt's own lifetime, he was out of favor. He received a commission alongside other artists. Here I give you another example, Ferdinand Bol. They were both commissioned, these paintings were both commissioned for the same locations to help decorate the newly created, the majestic town hall in Amsterdam that now serves as the Royal Palace. I think it doesn't take me to help you see how different these are. The Bol was much more what was in favor in the taste, much more in that spirit of the Terborch, those brighter colors, more primary colors. Here they're both working with classical, historical narratives that were probably given to them, but Rembrandt is so much into his own distinctive creative vision. It's often called rough in this approach, that painterliness which is now in the service of creating a mood, an atmosphere, as opposed to legibility. These things take us in another direction. The Bol, I'm fast-forwarding over several generations, but it's important in the narrative, gets you into the things which we would call now academic painting. Like those two previous examples, there was a drive for classically inspired, well-plotted, really well-organized, things that can be read across. We have some figures that are overlapping, but we really get to the central placement. We can understand this gesture. This is our main character. We see others responding to it, carefully placed so that we can read all of their different responses, literally in classical garb. And there was a perceived moral rigor to these things, not a roughness, but an intellectual esteem for antiquity, and especially models for the new republics in France and in the United States. And this, for a period of time, what was very much taught and promoted in the Academy. The French Academy was formed in 1648, but it becomes the dominant institution in the art world in France for centuries. Often the officially sanctioned school, it defined and instilled the approved aesthetic for the country and created tremendous influence on other academies in other locations. Ultimately, they also created the salons. Now, of course, here within things change as well. Here there are enormous, amazing automaton. A different approach, but still large, heroic, based on the classical nude. Regnault studied in Rome. A different version with more drama, including there's some painterliness, which is a bit more in the Delacroix range than an Ingres or Poussin type of approach. But really, and as you see it in our galleries, this is even larger than what I show you here on the screen. Now, I share this to give you the sense of the Academy. Sometimes we fast forward when we think of the realists, capital R, and later the Impressionists, and they're revolting and they're arguing for new things. What are they arguing against? These things. They're ultimately reacting, those figures of which we'll look at some, are reacting against these things. Now, some of this might be a well-known story to some of you, but what you might not know is that this maps exactly with the revival of interest in 17th century Dutch art in the 19th century, particularly in France. And let me focus a bit on perhaps the most key figure, Théophile Thoré. He's one of the most pivotal figures, interestingly, in the histories of both 19th century French art and 17th century Dutch art. He was an art critic, frequently reviewed the official salons, those that were promoted, those that were getting supported out of the Academy, beginning in the 1830s. He was a fan extolling Delacroix against Ingres. He encountered, as many people did, political issues, and he lived in exile for many years. When he returns, he writes under the pseudonym William Burger. William as in English, Burger as in German, combining these two different traditions, positioning himself, interestingly, not as French, despite the fact that he was writing in French, but he wrote a number of important publications. He reviewed first an exhibition in 1857 in Manchester, and then this, which I show you the title page, The Museums of Holland, published in 1858. There he writes and evaluates, he takes art criticism not of contemporary art, like he had been doing in the 1830s, but instead looks at the art that is in what is now the Netherlands and Belgium, or excuse me, the Netherlands. I'll get that. He writes about going to see works in the Rijksmuseum, the Mauritshuis. And what are those museums? Well, like today, they are filled with great examples of 17th century Dutch art. Historically, the Dutch institutions did not collect broadly, did not have great collections of Italian or French art. So when he goes and he's writing a book-length study of the Museums of Holland, what he's really doing is writing a history of 17th century Dutch art. And what he saw in that was, why did he turn to this? He saw it as a model. He looked at the 17th century Dutch art as a model for what could be done in his own lifetime. Humanity, simplicity, a republican spirit, and above all, of course, technical mastery. And how those things could then be models and the things that French artists of his lifetime could turn to. So he wrote The Museums of Holland in 1858. He wrote the first monographic article on Frans Hals in 1868 in the Gazette des Beaux-Arts. That's the exact same year that the automaton was painted. And there, Thoré, or sometimes we call him Thoré Burger, to account for both his real name and his pseudonym, writes of this painting, quote, "He painted so much. He painted, of Frans Hals, he painted so quickly and so well in his exaggerated brusqueness, his risky contrasts, his informal carelessness. There's always the hand of a bountifully talented painter and even a certain kind of genius. Somewhat superficial, it is true, and inspired by the external appearances of things, by movement, style, color, and effect, by whatever moves and glitters, rather than by the secret and spiritual side of life, even somewhat vulgar, if one can refer so to genius, but frank and bold, as irresistible as instinct." Elsewhere, he writes about Hals and compares his brushwork to swordplay, writing, "One could say that Frans Hals painted as if fencing, that he flicked his brush as if it were a foil. Oh, the adroit swashbuckler, extremely amusing to observe in his beautiful passes, sometimes a little reckless, to be sure, but as skillful as he is bold." These adulatory passages on brushwork were interpreted as signs and expressions of the artist's character. And he really gets into these quite deeply. And I'm giving you passages which give you an indication of the great admiration that Torre puts out. Writing of the famed Malababa in Berlin, quote, "The passion is here perhaps most abandoned to the furia of genius. In this painting and in several others, Frans Hals astounds by his violence of brushstroke and strangeness of tone, as do all impetuous colorists, such as El Greco, Herrera, and Goya." This is really quite radical if we think about it. This is very much a completely new approach of what he's putting out. He's reading emotions, he's reading the artist's movements from the paintings themselves, doing that process. But in the same time, what I hope is clear is he's rebuking centuries of critical neglect. There's avoidance, or there's talking about how this roughness in the 18th century is effective of Frans Hals being drunken and he can't control himself. There are these types of narratives which are clearly meant to disparage him, and Torre is doing something that is completely different, positioning these as really wonders, achievements, and in both passages, you no doubt noted the term genius. And Torre really was influential and really did set a new course for the appreciation of these things. Following up, the next writer, Eugene Fromentin, who wrote in 1876, Old Masters of Belgium and Holland. So a book-length study, a travelogue where he goes, like Torre did, and visits these various locations here also in Belgium, and talks about and performs art criticism. And there, in passages about Hals, Fromentin wrote, "Today the name of Hals reappears in our school at the moment when the love of the natural re-enters it, with some clamor and no little excess." In many ways, this is due to the efforts of Torre. Torre, who had argued for the centrality, for the boldness, for the genius of Hals, and already by 1878, 1876, one decade, depending on which publication you look at, already he's become entrenched. The position has turned. And we know Van Gogh read these things. He talks about reading Torre, and later he talks about reading Fromentin. In 1884, he said, "I read the Old Masters of Holland and Belgium by Fromentin with great pleasure. And in different places in that book, I again found the same questions dealt with that have preoccupied me very much recently, and about which I think continually, specifically at the end of my time in The Hague." Previously, he'd also talked about lending volumes of this to his brother. And he goes on to something that I think is interesting, and he expressed a preference. Van Gogh was multilingual and expressed a preference for French writers, saying, "Anyway, I know Rembrandt and the Dutch are scattered around museums and collections, and it's not very easy to form an idea of them if you only know the Louvre. However, it's the Frenchmen, Blanc, Torre, Fromentin, certain others, who've written better than the Dutch on that art." But the writers weren't the only ones, and Van Gogh, reading these things, he wasn't the only one who was inspired and turned. If we return to the arts themselves, we have examples of Van Gogh's predecessors in France who are turning very deliberately and intentionally to the example of Dutch art, and we'll focus on the case of Hals. This is Gustave Courbet, the great realist, capital R, who was really struck and inspired. He saw this painting by Hals when it was on exhibition at the International Exhibition in 1869 and made a literal copy of it that still exists. Clearly wanted to capture and look in the same way that Torre had, writing about this very same picture, no doubt inspired Courbet to work through how do you create something that has the same solutions as what Hals did. How better to understand it than to paint it yourself? This is not alone, and most of them are not copies, but are inspired by these things. Fontaine-Latour, for example, made this earlier, 1863, the painting on the left is the Homage to Delacroix. And this was exhibited as a response to the academic perspective in 1863, in the 1863 Salon. It is not just an homage to Delacroix, but an ode to realism. And it's populated by many important figures, including, respectively, to the left of the picture frame, this is a portrait of Delacroix. This is Whistler and Manet. Taken quite obviously, replacing a portrait for the window, and all of these figures. A very common scene, a great one by Frans Hals, where he's picturing the officers of the militia gathering around, but this compositional strategy, two groups in an almost V formation, that central object which breaks it up. Fontaine, of course, creates it flips it from a void into the painting, but this is all very intentional. We get some insight into Fontaine's Latour's approach from the biographer of Whistler, who apparently was planning also to create a painting that was inspired by Hals's group portraits. There, the biographer, an anonymous biographer, wrote, "Whistler in London caught the fever, planned to rival Fontaine in size, 10 feet by 6. And think about the size of these things. Everything looks the same when I show it to you here. Like Fontaine's, it would be a group of portraits. Interesting term, a group of portraits. We'll come back to that idea. Like Fontaine's, a tribute to realism, true to the life of their day, even as the great Harlem groups were true to life as Frans Hals knew it." Now, with my 17th century hat on, I might not say that these are entirely true to life from Frans Hals, but this was the idea that was circulating in the 19th century. But the compositional link, all of these artists standing around being a homage to Delacroix as the foreground, but through a compositional reference to Frans Hals. Positioning themselves as part of a history, part of a connection, right? They are simultaneously referencing 17th century Hals, early 19th century Delacroix, and themselves. So positioning themselves, positioning their project as a group of people involved in, interested in realism, again, capital R, and doing it through positioning themselves in relationship to historical precedents, as if validating their approaches by saying, we weren't the only ones to do it, these other great masters had done this too. We are rejecting the histories being taught elsewhere, but we also respect history and are looking at it. We're just reading a different history than you are. Manet very much followed suit in this. Manet loved Hals. Even here, I would argue, portraying himself as indebted to Hals in this painting in particular. Manet went to Haarlem in the Netherlands in 1872. He visited the new Haarlem Municipal Museum, which had only just opened in 1862. He's one of legions. Amazingly, we have the registered guest book for the museum, and it is filled with names of artists. Monet, Whistler, Sargent, Mary Cassatt, Manet, and many others from all over Europe and North America. And I think here we can see the earthy browns or the yellow mustardy palette, but it's that realism, that naturalism, but done in this sketchy, brushy, painterly way. If you compare Manet's jacket to those of Hals, it's not the same strokes again, but you get this effect all throughout. Or if you look at the face, the unblended brushstrokes, the ruddy cheeks that are popping out around or from these lighter skin tones. Different skin tones, but again, the approach is very similar. Picturing himself with a hat that is at that jaunty angle. Now, Hals is not a self-portrait, but you get the idea. Thinking about these things. And these are very intentional. And just like Van Gogh was, or I argue Van Gogh was, this is a very intentional self-promotional image of what Manet wants you to see. His painterly approach is unacademic, possibly anti-academic, that it is an ode to, instead, a much longer history. Unblended, the sense of speed, of spontaneity, drawn from the real world in which artists lived. Here, for example, in Manet's Le Bon Banc. Anton Prost wrote of Manet, quote, "The boldness of Frans Hals' forceful manner made such an impression on him in Holland that, back in Paris, armed with all those memories, he decided to take on frankly the diverse aspects of Parisian life. It is a smoker or a drinker sitting at a cafe. This is not a classical hero, real or obscured. This is an everyday person, somebody you would counter on the street." And that's what we think Hals was doing, or more so that's what in the 19th century they very much thought Hals was doing. Someone who was at a tavern offering us a drink. It's really quite clear. Manet submitted this to the 1873 Salon. And that connection was not missed by contemporaries. One critic who actually did not like Manet, and we have to remember that they weren't as universally praised, that they were rebelling against things, and so there are people who did not like that, said that Manet had put water in his beer. Interestingly, Alfred Stevens responded that if that's so, it must have been, quote, pure Harlem beer. So they get this, right? So they're not being, they are being clever, but they want their cleverness to be seen, right? That's part of the point. They're quoting, they're referencing, they're making connections compositionally, brushwork style, coloring, lighting, variety of options, so that they will be read in certain ways, positioning themselves in relationship to others. Going back to Van Gogh. So Van Gogh, and we get these things when we turn back to Van Gogh's descriptions, describing, he said, "What particularly struck me when I saw the old Dutch paintings again is that they were painted so quickly, that these great masters, Hals, Rembrandt, Ruysdael, so many others, as far as possible just put it straight down and didn't come back to it so very much." Again, this is really close language to what he's read in Torre, this idea of speed, of unfinished, of painterliness. It's not direct verbatim quotations, but he's clearly digested, assimilated, and adopted the thinking of those writers that he had read. And what I want to point that out here is, so when Van Gogh turns to Hals, as we'll dive more deeply, it was not in a vacuum. He's turning to Hals, he's turning to Rembrandt in the context of this revival of interest in 17th century Dutch art and the particular ways that it was discussed at the time. He encountered Hals through Torre Berger, but also through Courbet and Manet and the others who had already turned to these particular examples. Van Gogh's words again, this time in a letter to Theo in 1885, describing this picture which he saw in the Rijksmuseum. "In his portrait and that of his wife in the garden, there are two black violets, blue violet and reddish violet, and a solid black, yellow black. Repeat, reddish violet and blue violet black and black. Not just one, but 27 blacks." This is that last part that sometimes popularly gets thrown out. Frans Hals, in the same letter he continues, "Frans Hals was a colorist among colorists, a colorist like Veronese, like Rubens, like Delacroix, like Velázquez." So he's turning to this, which indeed is a wonderful symphony of color, even though it's, in some passages, almost monochrome, right? And I think you can really get this. When you get really up close, it becomes even more astounding, but even at some distance, take any of the passages, or the violets and the blacks. These are traditional black garments, which were common at the time in the 17th century, the types of garments that these individuals would have wore, but it's Hall's mastery of creating, a blending, of thinking in color, and how he molds and fuses and makes different variations of this same color all in the same painting to communicate different things, and how as a painter, I'm astounded by them. I have no artistic talent whatsoever. But if Van Gogh, who's this amazing painter, turns to a painting like this and it's like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. How does he do it? And he's trying to think through it, and he's trying to think about color. Van Gogh uses very different colors, of course, but the relationship of color and what color can mean and also that term to phrase Hals a colorist in that tradition. They're constantly thinking about this tradition. Different artists are parts of different traditions, but the same figures keep on coming up. Delacroix, Hals, Manet, Van Gogh. And that is very intentional in seeing him as academic, as anti-academic as others had before. Now, the other thing that we get is that we really get a sense that Van Gogh was going all around and visiting museums and looking at things, and particularly Dutch art, not exclusively, but particularly throughout his career. So let's trace those a little bit, because I think it also gets interesting when you take stock of the entirety of what he's doing. He was a frequent museum visitor, and he led a peripatetic life, often visiting those museums. He was in London. Today, London is home to significant collections of paintings by Frans Hals. Interestingly, there were very few that Van Gogh could have seen when he had time in the British capital. Van Gogh was in London between May 12, 1873, and the end of August 1873, and again for a few months in the fall of 1874, returning again in January through May 1875. Lots of details, but you get the idea. He's moving all around. The National Gallery did not acquire its first painting by Hals until after Van Gogh's last stay in London in 1876, but he could have seen the Laughing Cavalier when it was on display at a branch of the South Kensington Museum, when it was on loan from 1872 to 75. This painting had gained international notoriety because Lord Hertford had purchased it for a staggering sum. It made international news. He paid 51,000 francs for it, 8 times the estimate. This made headlines all over the Western world. And as it did, it would be reasonable that an artistically minded individual in London like Van Gogh might have sought the opportunity to see it. But it doesn't appear in his letters, and we don't actually see reference to it in his works, or at least I don't. There were other things that he could have seen, but it's somewhat surprising. But it's really important when he sees things. And that's part of it. He's there too early. He's not thinking about Hals and Dutch art yet. He could have been. He could have already read Touré, could have read Fromentin, but it really hasn't sunk in yet because he's not thinking that way as an artist. He had ample opportunity, as we've already seen, to see paintings in the Netherlands. And he was in the Netherlands between 1881 and 85. And he wrote many times about visiting museums. These are in Haarlem, the municipal museum that Manet went to. We know he went there. He talks about going to see it, where he could see things like the group portrait that Fontaine-Latour had quoted earlier, along with many other group portraits and some individual portraits. It really was a place where you could study Hals in surprising depth. And he actually encourages others to go see those things too. He visits the Rijksmuseum on multiple times. That was an interesting time in that history. It was founded in 1798 and resided at one location in Amsterdam, in the Trippenhaus, before moving to its current building in 1885. And Van Gogh, we know, visited it in both locations, commenting on the Merry Drinker, as we'll get to in more detail, which had been acquired, the portrait of the couple in the garden, which we looked at, and very specifically, this picture. The so-called meager company owned by the city of Amsterdam lent to the Rijksmuseum was on display in 1885 when the Rijksmuseum opened in its new location, as well as some other pictures. Now, Van Gogh writes about this painting at length. Bear with me, it's going to be a fair passage, but I think it's really quite fascinating. It's one of the longer passages that he writes about any specific work of art. He wrote to it in the fall, October 10th, 1885, so in the new building, to his brother Theo. I don't know whether you remember that to the left of the Night Watch, in the words as pendant to the Syndics, there's a painting. It was unknown to me until now, by Frans Hals and Peter Cotta. 20 or so officers full length. Have you noticed it? And he uses 3 question marks. In itself, the painting alone makes the trip to Amsterdam well worthwhile, especially for a colorist. Now he's calling himself a colorist. There's a figure in it, the figure of the standard bearer at the extreme left corner, right up against the frame. That figure is gray from top to toe. Let's call it pearly gray, of a singular neutral tone, probably obtained with orange and blue mixed so that they neutralize each other. By varying this basic color in itself, by making it a little lighter here, a little darker there, the whole figure, as it were, painted with one and the same gray. But the leather soles are a different material from the leggings, which are different from the folds of the breeches, which are different from the doublet, expressing different materials, very different in color from one another, still all in one family of gray. But wait, into that gray, he now introduces blue and orange and some white. The doublet has satin ribbons of a divine soft blue. Orange, white, blue, as the national colors were then. Orange and blue next to each other. The glorious spectrum, on a ground of gray, judiciously mixed precisely by uniting just those two, let me call them poles of electricity, in terms of color, so that they obliterate each other, a white against that gray. Further carried through in that painting, other orange spectrums against a different blue. Further, the most glorious blacks against the most glorious whites, the heads, some 20, sparkling with spirit and life, and how they're done, and what color. The superb appearance of all those fellows, full length, but the orange, white, blue chap in the left corner. I've seldom seen a more divinely beautiful figure. It is something marvelous. Think about taking that long just to write that in a letter or an email. I mean, you can feel the energy that he has, and that he's this one figure in this one painting that he hadn't seen before, and he's just amazed and going over and over again, thinking about the color, the application, how the colors are sitting beside each other, how they work to fuse this totally new creation. Really enamored to the nth degree. Spent a lot of time in Paris, not surprisingly, and this offered him opportunity to see paintings at the Louvre. When he was there were 4 paintings that we still consider by Hals, and another 5 that were then attributed, such as the one on the right, which I show you too, also in that sense of emerging art history and understanding of artists that we would no longer think is by Hals himself. The so-called Gypsy Girl certainly was. But those unattributed ones give you this different picture, and if it's almost half of the things that you're looking at, you can see why Rembrandt would write this when he said, "As I have told you, it is Haarlem that a painter in search of fine, strong lessons ought to give himself the pleasure of seeing Frans Hals. Everywhere else, in our French cabinets or museums, in the Dutch galleries or collections, the idea that one forms of this brilliant master, so very unequal in manner, is a seductive, agreeable, rather frivolous, but it is neither true nor equitable." In other words, it's a misleading picture. You have to go elsewhere. And this is indeed what Van Gogh was doing. A lot of it was very interested in, very particularly in his time in Belgium, where he encountered these 2 works, which are in the exhibition. He lived in Brussels, 1880 to 81, and also spent time in Antwerp, and again saw these particular pictures. And here we get, again, being just blown away and falling in love with these, this time from Anton Kersmakers, who writes of visiting the museum in Antwerp with Van Gogh. He recalls, "Suddenly he's gone from my side, and I see him walking up to the painting, and me after him. When I came up to him, he was standing with hands folded as if in prayer in front of the painting, and whispered, 'Do you see that?' He said after a while, 'Now that's painting. Look.' And following the direction of the broad strokes with his thumb, he just leaves it as he puts it down." Again and again, you get these passages really just falling in love with these things. Now, so he sees them, he goes, visits a wide variety of museums. He also knew of Hals from reproductive prints in 1873. The German printmaker William Unger made a series of 20 reproductive prints after Frans Hals, which broadened some of the things that he would have already seen, such as this group portrait in Haarlem, but also some things that Van Gogh would not have seen in person. He had not seen this painting, as far as we know, Van Gogh did not go to Munich, so it also broadened his larger repertoire. In total, through these various sources of direct engagements, those things that we know from his letters, as well as through the reproductive prints, Van Gogh had knowledge of as many as 30 autograph paintings by Hals. It's possible that he could have seen some of the others that came up in the auctions and the sales in Brussels and Paris, but I have yet to find evidence of that. They also, interestingly, they give a representative overview, even though it's not the entirety. So 30, now we're thinking Hals painted, let's call it 225 just to keep it 200, 225 to keep it real. But so he didn't know the entirety of his body of work, but a pretty good sample size, and including of different types of paintings. Regents, regentsses, group portraits, double portraits, single portraits, things we would call single-figure genre scenes. And so as a result, Van Gogh gained exposure also to a wide variety of styles, the early Hals, the late Hals, and as you can, even culminating in the very last regentsses of the almshouse now, then and now in Haarlem. And this is very much also something I haven't pointed out, but very much related to Van Gogh's interest in portraits. Van Gogh wrote the day before he began The Postman of Hals. He painted portraits, nothing, nothing, nothing but that. Portraits of soldiers, gatherings of officers, portraits of magistrates assembled for business of the Republic, portraits of blah, 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 blah. He keeps on going, including, very particularly, the bon vivant, mustachioed, booted, and spurred, this particular portrait. And that's part of, I think, one of the really interesting things of the exhibition. These aren't just types. These often are the specific things that Van Gogh was looking at. An amazing portrait, relaxed, spontaneous, leaning back in your chair, really groundbreaking. And so this is what he's thinking about this, amongst the other things, the day before beginning The Postman. You're probably wondering when we're going to get to this. Takes me a while, I'm long-winded, but here we are. Thinking about getting into the Roulin family. And so Hals and these other things were top of his mind. He also, interestingly, is thinking about this painting, Adrian van Ostade, which then, as now, is in the Louvre. And he writes about this, perhaps an unusual choice to single out of all the masterpieces in the Louvre, an artist, a very fine painting, of course, but of all your choices to pick this. And he writes of it, now if, for example, I claim that the Van Ostade in the Louvre, which shows the painter's family, the man, the wife, the 10 or so kids, is a painting infinitely deserving of study and thought. If the paintings in the gallery at the Louvre that I personally prefer and find most astonishing are very often forgotten by the very artists who go to see the Dutchman, then I'm not in the least surprised, knowing that my own choice in the gallery is based on knowledge of the subject that most French couldn't have. Yeah, there's a lot in there, right? So he's very much thinking, we no longer think this is the self-portrait, but he's thinking about a group portrait, how to portray a family to this particular example. And this is another type of thing that's in his mind when he's thinking about, he does it over a variety of canvases. These are but a few of the 26, but he's thinking about the Roulin family as a group, taken together, like the Van Ostade, part of a project. So wonderful individually, but really conceived as a group, as a project to take this very view. Perhaps like a series, anticipating things like Monet's Haystack series, but a study of a family, needing multiple images to convey the idea of the whole. So there's the whole, but on the individual level, he's looking at this Merry Drinker, which we already were looking at with the Manet. Clearly inspired by it. We know he saw it. He writes about this specific picture in the Rijksmuseum. An everyday subject, the pose, the composition, the painterliness. And again, to give you this idea of the finish, he writes, I'm more convinced than ever that the true painters did not finish their things in the way which is used only too often, namely correct when one scrutinizes it closely. The best painters, and from a technical view the most complete, seen from nearby, are but patches of color side by side and only make an effect at a distance. Done differently, but we see that Van Gogh is doing this very same thing. I'll read that in a moment, but I also want to point out, it's a little small. I actually didn't realize this until I was writing for the catalog. And I don't know how on earth this could be. They're almost the exact same size. But those things that we were looking at with Van Gogh, with Hals, right? He's unblended brushworks, some of the stereotypical images. He locks in forms at the very end. This is a blue, this is a smear of blue. He doesn't draw the form of the jacket and then color it in. He starts with the overall broad color and then draws lines on top of it. I really think about this as drawing in paint. right? You can really get these, and get those sense of these jabs and these long marks of which he's doing it. The unblended brushwork of the face, or even an amazing passage is actually in the background of this almost like proto-Mondrian squaring off of forms in a geometric sense in the background of the painting. Really creating these things that, as Torre was describing Hals, this type of thing, flurry of brushstrokes. And if we think about the monochrome, it'd be really easy to think about that perhaps if Van Gogh was writing about his own picture, that he would have said he used 27 different blues. Drawing, we get even one element that was missing from the painted, the glass of the alcoholic beverage. But I think you really get a sense of the lineage here, the three things going together. So I've argued that Van Gogh is looking at Hals, but not in isolation. He's looking at him, looking at Hals directly, but he's also looking at Hals through Manet, through others, and responding. And so when he creates a painting that responds to Hals, he's also creating a painting that responds to Manet. And he's thinking, and he has this phrase, he calls himself a link in the chain of artists. He is part of this history, part of this tradition, and he's very carefully cultivating it. All of the colorings, all of the approaches are different, but you see a through line, a thread, a chain. And Van Gogh very much wants to be part of that chain, and it's not just a random chain, it's connected to these very specific examples. It's a means to create a positive artistic identity for himself. He's framing, he's trying to condition how you see him. He's expressing his ideas and his ideas about what painting is, should be, can be. But he's also doing it about himself and wanting people to read him, to think about him in these ways. Now, he's doing this, I think also interestingly, he's making these paintings in Arles. So he's turning to this example of Hals, of the Hethuizen, maybe the Ostade, to Dutch art outside the Netherlands. And this seems to be part of his project as well for creating a distinctive artistic identity. He links himself, as I've been suggesting, in a variety of aesthetic ways, also a way to argue for his own modernity, but he places himself within that very specific tradition and invoking these Dutch artists as well. As he said in the quote earlier, he feels he can understand them better than others, but he's also claiming for himself to be a Dutch artist working in France. This is, of course, something that distinguishes him from his fellow painters as well. So he's aligning himself with a lineage both in the postman, both Dutch and French. And this is how he was perceived. Albert Aurier wrote in 1890, for example, of Van Gogh, quote, "He is truly and completely Dutch, of the sublime lineage of Frans Hals." So he accomplished his goal, seen as in relation to those perspectives. Now, the other interesting thing that I think is happening here is that he's thinking about a body of work. And this is a pretty new way of thinking. That he'd seen the wide range of Hals's. He'd seen from a variety of different periods of his life. But there's a new way. He was unfamiliar with these people had relatively little idea of Hals because there was a whole move to reconstruct an entire artist. The first article appears in 1868. He's relatively unknown, but all of a sudden you get a whole body of work. And there's an interest in this idea of a body of work, in addition to focusing on single objects. And it was interconnected to a lot of things that were going on in contemporary art criticism. Torre Berger, as I suggested, reconstructed entire artist oeuvres in looking from artists of the past. Perhaps more famously, he did this for Vermeer in 1866, before he did it for all Hals in 1868, penning articles on entire artist's output. This might seem standard, right? This is what we're doing in exhibitions, but actually for a long time, you just wrote about or thought about an individual object. In this point in the later part of the 19th century, for the first time, you're getting widespread consideration of a body of an artist's work. This is about the same time, for the example, of the emergence of the solo exhibition. There was a Delacroix retrospective in 1855, and he had retrospective exhibitions of his works in 1855 and 1867. The dealer Paul Durand-Ruel organized single artist shows for Renoir, Monet, Pissarro in the last decades of the 19th century. And indeed, by 1890, Monet stopped exhibiting his work with other artists. In other words, only wanting to be seen across the body of their own work. There's writings in Germany, which I don't have time to get into, which are also participating in this. The idea of the reproductive prints of a body of an artist's work. And I think this is very much part of Van Gogh's thinking. Compendiums of lives, pinned by Touré. There's the Vermeer article from '76, or even an interesting book by Zola in 1866, L'Oeuvre. This is also the time when the word oeuvre begins to enter in the French and English language in a much broader way. And Van Gogh had related ideas about these. I'd be remiss if I didn't see Frans Hals from our own collection. He had related ideas and wrote, for example, to Bernard that he writes, let's talk about Frans Hals. Never did he paint Christ's annunciations to shepherds, angels or crucifixions and resurrections. Never did he paint voluptuous naked women. He painted portraits, nothing but that. But there's that portraiture, but also that he feels he has the entirety of Hals's career in his mind. An entire set, perhaps not unlike what he's doing in the Roulin family. Considered these to be a set, 26 in total, that he wrote that his goal for painting these were, quote, to paint an entire family. He spread that focus across multiple canvases, but this is what he does. So, let me skip ahead. In conclusion, the impact of historical Dutch art on Van Gogh was multifaceted. The art of his countrymen offered pictorial solutions, compositional models and brushwork, and the perceived opportunity to marshal formal elements to express the character of an artist, not just of a subject. Dutch art's emphasis on portraiture was particularly appealing to Van Gogh, as he wrote in 1885 from Antwerp, "Painted portraits have a life of their own that come from deep in the soul of the painter and where the machine can't go. The more photographs one looks at, it seems to me, the more one feels this." And it was no coincidence that Van Gogh looked at his fellow countrymen as they, especially Hals, were central to artistic and aesthetic discourses of the time, especially in France. And this resurrection of interest in Hals offered a new way for Hals to think about his career, or artistic careers more broadly. Perhaps that Hals had experienced critical neglect also held some appeal for Van Gogh, as he himself was striving for recognition after toiling in relative obscurity. Though Hals is a rediscovered artist and the ways in which he could be introduced to new audiences through an entire body of work, Van Gogh was able to formulate his own distinctive path forward. Thank you.
We have time for some questions. We have mics on either side of the room.
Thank you. Thank you very much for a really enlightening lecture. It was really interesting the way you juxtaposed the paintings. I had a very specific, it might be nitpicky question. In the painting, The Meager Company?
Yeah.
And the description where Van Gogh talks about blue, is it the representation on the screen that you don't see blue, or in person can you see blue? I know blue and gray paint, you know, there's similarities, and it's maybe a slightly tinge of blue. Oh, I thought that he was talking about the blue.
Some of it is mixed in, which I think is
Okay.
difficult to see, and that you need to get up close to it. And yes, there is some, we have very fine projection equipment, but is not the same thing as seeing things in person. But yes, he's reading some of that from the painting, which is mixed so finely, might be hard to see in this particular setting.
Thank you. I had one other question, and maybe there's no answer to it. I know that there are some people who see the world in color, just their perception of everything is color. Is there any indication that Van Gogh was one of those people? I mean, his paintings would indicate that to me, but
I don't know. I see the same thing you do, but I don't have any evidence of that. I mean, he talks in that way. I mean, I've tried to suggest that color was a loaded language, but the way he paints, indeed, his color is so central. I mean, even just from the number of passages, how many passages did I quote from where he's talking about color, that he's really obsessed with it and trying to figure out, he's thinking about it, he's seeing it, he's going back and writing about it, he's trying to work it out in his own paintings. So it would not surprise me if that suggestion is true. We have one in the front here.
Please, can you wait for the microphone, because we have people online too.
So you talk about hands with the two artists, and I'm glad you brought that up, because I've always been fascinated by Van Gogh's, the way he does hands, particularly in The Postman. I always thought, maybe I was taking it too literally, that he was trying to create arthritic hands, someone who used his hands. But then in our exhibit, I saw one of the children, I forget which ones, the hands are painted similarly in that gnarled way. So am I being too literal? Is it just his way of expression?
Yeah, I would tend to think that it is about expression, trying to communicate overly I don't know what his hands look like, but they seem overly elongated to me. I think what exactly he's trying to express, I think that's up for individuals' interpretation. There's a casualness in the way that they lean over, but yeah, it's difficult. Sometimes it's hard to draw conclusions sometimes about when an artist is making something based in reality as opposed to expression. But I think you're onto something, and seeing a related approach again across multiple subjects might be interesting.
Hi. First off, as a fellow University of Kansas alum, Rock Chalk.
Rock Chalk Jayhawk.
Go KU. So I know this was all about portraiture. So my question or thought or rambling might be a slight departure or tangent, but do we know, did Van Gogh ever say anything or mention or write about Dutch still life, particularly Dutch florals? I just know I'm a huge Dutch fangirl myself, but I know florals are like such a predominant part of that world, and also too, I sometimes when I think of Van Gogh, I just immediately think of florals versus
sunflowers.
Yeah, and irises and that type of thing. I just didn't know if he ever mentioned that or if that was ever on his radar.
I don't recall. I've never actually looked to see whether he's thinking. It would make perfect sense if he was, as you're suggesting in the question. But I haven't looked. He was. Yeah, I mean, go look. You can search in the. They're all digitized and things. It would be an interesting process. Roystal, I didn't talk about landscapes. He does talk about Dutch landscapes. So he's not, by which I mean he's not exclusively tied to the human figure. So it would make sense, but I don't know of a specific example.
Cool. Okay, your next book idea. You're welcome.
Thank you. There's one here.
Question online.
Yeah.
This person asks, with which contemporary Dutch artist did Van Gogh interact?
Okay, this is a 17th century person I'm not as good at. He does make some references to some of his contemporary painters throughout, but I'm blanking off the top of my head. There's another question up here in the middle.
Let's see here. How best to other side.
It helps our online audience hear what the question is.
No, about the florals.
Yes.
Okay, I think when he moved to Paris at some point, he lived with his brother. Oh, he lived with his brother, and he did all these flower paintings, just tons and tons and tons, going through it. So.
Yeah, no, exactly. He did make many, including some very important and famous things. not just in volume. Like I said, I'm not sure that he talks about those artists. I'm trying to recall. I mean, we're still indebted, I think, to, sorry, I'm also trying to go into the mental Rolodex of Torre and Fromentin, who I think don't spend much time on that either. To the point, it's that we're still talking about at this time, the hierarchy of genres, where figure painting is at the top, still life is at the very bottom. So I think they're not, so he's doing them, absolutely, but what is he thinking about and where does he get inspiration in those particular ones? I'm not exactly sure.
Okay, we have our last question right here.
When did Van Gogh become a blockbuster?
Interesting question. I think, well, when the blockbuster started in the late 19th century. But I'm not as much into the history of that, but I think it's, if I had to guess, mid 20th century. It's really a great question. You know, this fluctuation of taste, Van Gogh in the Dutch pronunciation, who's not as, just like I've argued for Hals and Vermeer, and there are changes in things. I think he really ascended, much like the appreciation for all things late 19th century French here. But that's an excellent segue. If you haven't had a chance to go see the exhibition, highly recommend it. I'm sure many of you have already. Go back and see it again. I just went again this morning. There's more things to discover. But thank you all for your time. It's really a pleasure.